This room came to order before we asked the room to come to order. First on Capitol Hill. Give folks a minute to take their seats. Well, welcome. Thank you all for taking time out today to join us. Special welcome to our friends from Louisiana and the congressional staffers who have carved time out of their very busy schedules. My name is Jake Horowitz. I work for the PEW Charitable Trust as Director of Research and Policy for our Public Safety Performance Project. We work with states to safely reduce correctional populations. I'm really excited for today's event. Really excited for the remarks by Governor John Bel Edwards, our panel, his colleagues from Louisiana. And the reason I'm excited is that there's a lot of talk about criminal justice and about public safety policy. And that's a good thing, but talk only gets us so far. And the folks you're going to hear from today put that talk into action. And you're going to get their answers to the why and the how and the what. So why are we talking about a package of 10 bills that got passed a few months ago, 1,200 miles southwest of here? In some ways, the Louisiana story reflects and provides insight into the U.S. story. But Louisiana is also an outlier, making it a bellwether worth paying attention to. After remaining relatively stable for nearly half a century, the U.S. incarceration rate grew fourfold between the mid-'70s and the mid-2000s. By 2007, 2.3 million adults, 1 in every 100, was behind bars. And this growth was not driven by underlying socio-demographic trends, crime trends. It was driven by policy choices about who goes to prison and how long they stay there. Louisiana emerged as the most imprisoned state and the most imprisoned nation in the world. An unfortunate distinction is held for nearly 20 years. Enter Governor John Bel Edwards, a graduate of West Point with 8 years of active military service in the U.S. Army. Governor Edwards comes from a family chock full of sheriffs. And from the start of his 2015 gubernatorial campaign, when he was a member of the Louisiana House, Governor Edwards made it clear that he was going to work to help Louisiana move out of that #1 imprisonment spot. His commitment detailed with a project that was just kicking off in Louisiana. A few months before he was elected, the legislature created a task force to examine Louisiana's criminal justice system and make policy recommendations. And this approach was an adoption of a proven model for state-level policy change and system improvement. Since 2007, more than 30 states have enacted policies to contain and reduce correctional populations and costs while maintaining the long-term nationwide trend of lower crime rates that began in the early 1990s. Many of these reforms were advanced with technical assistance provided to states under the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, a partnership between the U.S. Department of Justice and the PEW Charitable Trust. Louisiana's Justice Reinvestment Task Force, a who's who of criminal justice policymakers and influencers, examined the state's criminal justice system and recommended statutory and budgetary changes with the goal of focusing prison space on the most chronic, violent individuals, strengthening alternatives to imprisonment, and removing barriers to successful reentry. It was encouraged and aided and informed by a coalition of voices from the business and faith, crime survivor, and law enforcement communities. And the new laws spanning from victim notification to elimination of certain mandatory minimums should allow Louisiana to shed its status as the most imprisoned state within the next year, with projected reductions in the prison and community supervised population of 10% and 12% respectively. And 70% of the expected $250 million in savings has been dedicated to local programs that will reduce recidivism and serve the needs of crime survivors. As Congress considers federal sentencing and corrections legislation, there are many lessons from the states, lessons about bipartisanship, about basing policy decisions on data and research, about harnessing the power of a diverse coalition of voices to remain focused on results. And I hope the panel will draw out some of those lessons. 4 weeks ago, several of the most significant elements of the legislative package in Louisiana took effect. Most notably, some 1,900 people serving time for nonviolent offenses were released to parole supervision an average of 2 months sooner than they otherwise would have been. Now, released from prison just several weeks early might not sound like much, but for families who were reunited for Thanksgiving last week, these policy changes have real meaning. Continuing in that spirit, I want to thank you all again for joining us today. And now to speak about Louisiana's historic effort on criminal justice and public safety, please welcome Governor John Bel Edwards.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you. I'm honored to be here at the Capitol with you all, and my speechwriter put it, you all. Had I been delivering this in Louisiana, it'd been y'all. I just want you to know that. As some of you know, Louisiana made national headlines earlier this summer when we passed a comprehensive package of reforms to our criminal justice system, and that's what you were just told about. I happen to be very proud of this work and also the broad bipartisan coalition that made it happen. And I believe that there are some important takeaways for other states and also for Congress in the work that we did in Louisiana. And that's why it's important that we're all here today. So thank you. Louisiana has long held the title of America's most incarcerated state. And that's a title we're not proud of, and we're determined to make it part of our past, not part of our future. And so Louisiana has people that are locked in prison cells at a rate nearly double the national average. And until recently, the imprisonment rate was head and shoulders above even the second-ranked state, which is Oklahoma. But that is about to change. Louisiana's adopted reforms, and we're closing the gap. And the last I checked, we are neck and neck with Oklahoma. Now, for most of you who are not from Louisiana, you say, well, what's this big deal? Well, we've been number one for so long that if we can just get to be number two, that shows a tremendous amount of progress. And, of course, the goalposts ought to be moving because I hope every other state is moving in the same direction, which will make it harder for us to get to number two. By the end of this year, early next year, we expect to shed that title. Now, I made a commitment in my campaign for governor in 2015 that at the end of my first term, which means I anticipate a second term, but okay, at the end of my first term, we would not have the highest incarceration rate in the nation. And it looks like we're going to make that. And why is it important? Each year in Louisiana, we spend roughly $2/3 of $1 billion on corrections. And almost all of that goes to beds in a prison. That's the third largest state expenditure behind education and health care. And it's a huge burden on our taxpayers. And quite simply, there's not a good return on our investment. 1 in 3 released inmates return to prison within 3 years. So the recidivism rate is not good. Public safety is not being enhanced. And so this poor return on investment, I think, was the key to building that broad coalition of support for the reforms. So we asked leading experts in our state and also around the country, and certainly with the help of the Pew Charitable Trust, to take a hard look at our criminal justice system, to think big about possible changes, and to find a way for us to be safer, spend less, invest where we should, and certainly do less harm. And this is what Pew found. In Louisiana, we sent more people to prison for drug possession than any other crime. Drug possession. We had cut behavioral health services in the community, and enormous numbers of people with addiction and mental health issues had landed in our jails and in our prisons. Without services to address the underlying causes of their behavior, many of the citizens were simply being warehoused. With their lives derailed and roadblocks at every step toward reentry, they cycled in and out of prison. And as one sheriff that I know says, they were serving a life sentence, just doing it in small installments at a time. For those who committed more serious crimes, we often locked them up beyond the point when they were so old and infirm that they posed absolutely no threat. Our prisons have become nursing homes and hospices. Our policy became about vengeance rather than public safety, punishment, and rehabilitation. As large as our prison system was, we placed twice as many people under correctional control in the community. And our probation officers had too many people to supervise, way beyond what best practices would tell you was a smart thing to do. We buried probationers under debt with more fines and fees than they could reasonably pay, and we made it hard for them to get a job. Too many victims also said the victim was inaccessible, and too many victims and defendants said it didn't feel like justice to them. And we got there because for decades in Louisiana, lawmakers spoke in terms of being tough on crime, because that's what we all thought the public wanted, and that's what they thought was safe from a political standpoint. But when we actually polled Louisiana voters this past spring, we found out some surprising things, and I suspect that this would play out around the country. 3 in 4 voters supported eliminating mandatory minimum sentences and giving judges more discretion over criminal penalties. In short, judges should be allowed to be judges. We had taken that away from them. 2 in 3 voters believed that fewer people should be sent to prison for nonviolent crimes and that we should expand eligibility for alternatives like probation and parole. Republican and Democratic voters alike overwhelmingly thought penalties should be lower for drug crimes and that long prison terms were far less important than the need to reduce reoffending. And certainly, we are mindful that there are some offenders who commit crimes that are so heinous that they deserve to be punished and locked away for a very long time, maybe even for life, and maybe that's the only way to protect the public from them. But that is clearly the exception, not the rule. So we changed our laws. Rather than settle for the system we had, rather than settling for the system we had built, we started building something better. And while we knew we had to do something, we didn't want to just do anything. So we pursued data-driven, evidence-based policies that would produce a better return on investment. And by the way, that's a huge buzzword, return on investment. And business people understand that term, where we could actually spend less, invest more, and be safer as a result. Focusing on non-sex, non-violent offenders, and then making sure that we reinvest most of the savings. So the bills reduce penalties for people who break the law in nonviolent ways and focus prison beds on more serious crimes. The bills eliminated mandatory minimum. Let me go back just a second. So with the recommendations from the expert task force, a bipartisan group of state senators and representatives drafted and passed a package of 10 bills, and I signed them all into law on June the 15th. And I'm very proud of that work, and you're going to hear from 3 folks in Louisiana here shortly who did more than just about anybody else to make that happen. Those bills reduce penalties for people who break the law in nonviolent ways and focus prison beds on more serious crimes. They eliminated mandatory minimum prison terms for drug and property crimes. They shaved months off long prison terms and redirected dollars saved into programs that stop the cycle in and out of prison. The package of reforms invests in services to protect and support crime victims. The package gives victims better access to decision makers in our courts and a stronger voice with our parole board. It allows those inmates who are seriously ill to be treated in hospitals rather than prison cells. And the reform package gave some of our longest-serving prisoners a meaningful opportunity to be considered for release. They also helped to clear away barriers to reentry for those coming out of prison. What we knew was the laws that we had in place, under those laws, 95% of the people were going to get out of prison, and they were not being successful upon reentry. And every time someone is unsuccessful upon reentry, you create at least one new crime victim. And so by focusing on that, we would actually do better in terms of public safety. More people returning home from prison will now be able to get a job, get food and housing, pay their restitution and child support, and yes, pay taxes. We know that success is often determined upon reentry within the first 72 hours. An individual has to know that there is a way for him to support himself. And that he can have some, or she can have some quality of life. And so you have to have those systems in place at the outset if you want to maximize your effectiveness. More people getting out will have the resources that they need to stay out for the long term. To adopt changes like these, groups who approach crime and justice from very different perspectives had to listen to one another. And you know, we're all good at talking. Listening is much harder. And having a good dialogue. We had to set anecdotes and fear tactics aside, look at the facts, and find common ground. And that's why it's important to have folks who are respected, folks who have credibility, like the Pew Charitable Trust there, helping in these efforts. Our statewide District Attorneys Association endorsed all 10 bills. With the month left in the legislative session, their director held a press conference, and this is what he said. We're hoping that with these changes, we can generate some savings, build up these services, and lower our incarceration rate safely. That's why we're behind it. So Republicans and Democrats, and we have 3 or 4 independents in our House chamber as well, they came together recognizing that a broken justice system leads to more crime, not less. And we were able to bring in people from the business community, the religious community, both the religious right and the religious left. Corrections officials and budget experts in our state expect these changes to reduce Louisiana's prison population by 10% over the next decade. That's nearly 4,000 fewer prison beds. Now, for many of you, that number may not seem too large. I come from a town that has 2,000 people. That's twice my hometown. And that's going to save an estimated $262 million. The changes will also reduce the community supervision population by 12% over the same time period, about 8,000 fewer people under correctional control in the community. And this will significantly reduce our officers' caseloads and allow them to focus their time and their attention on those who most need correction and support. With this legislation, we also made a commitment to reinvest 70% of the savings to reduce recidivism and support victims of crime. This creates millions of dollars each year in new incentive grants and expanded programs and services in parts of our state that have long underserved both victims and offenders. Just a few days after I signed the bills into law, the New York Times called it, and this is, quote, one of the most ambitious criminal justice reform packages in the country, 10 new laws that make important changes to everything from drug sentences, parole and community supervision to reentry and victims' rights. They also said it would have been remarkable coming from any state, but it's historic coming from Louisiana. And our local newspaper in Baton Rouge, The Advocate, said it's the boldest change of direction for Louisiana since the reform of the New Orleans public schools after Hurricane Katrina. So we want to tell this story not just in Louisiana, but around the country and certainly here in Washington, D.C., because mass incarceration is not just Louisiana's shame. It is America's. It's costly, and it's a failing policy built on arguments that no longer ring true. We're a bellwether for the nation on this front. Our nation imprisons our own citizens that are at a rate that is unprecedented in our country's history and in human history. And I'm extraordinarily proud that my state may be at the tip of the spear, leading us in a different direction. Not just a different direction, but a much better direction. So as Congress considers various bills that would update and improve federal sentencing and corrections laws, I hope that Louisiana's story can put wind in their sails. Change is possible, bipartisan wins are possible, and the stakes couldn't be higher. And so I'm grateful to be joined today by my friends and colleagues from Louisiana, Natalie Laborde, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Louisiana Department of Corrections, and she is representing Secretary Jimmy LeBlanc, who headed up the task force driving these reforms. State Representative Tanner McGee, who is a strong champion for reform, working in the Louisiana House of Representatives, and Craig Weber, Sheriff of Lafourche Parish and former president of the National Sheriff's Association, who lent his experience and expertise to these efforts in a way that was very, very meaningful. So I think you'll find their insights are incredibly fascinating and important. And I want to say thank you to our friends at the Pew Charitable Trust who provided exceptional assistance as we undertook this project in Louisiana, who immediately lent their name and the credibility to these efforts. And I want to thank them for hosting this event also. And I want to make a quick plug and thank Congress for the ongoing federal appropriation that supports justice reinvestment efforts in the states. Some of that funding is helping Louisiana to implement the reforms we passed this summer, and it's improving the lives of tens of thousands of people in our state. We talked just a little bit about a task force. I became governor halfway through the task force. The task force had actually been created and was meeting before I became governor. But that task force was critical to our success. The Senate, the House, the Supreme Court, and the governor's office each had members on that task force. I actually selected a gentleman, I only had one appointee, named Flozell Daniels, who runs a foundation in Louisiana that helps strengthen some of the communities in our state that are most impacted by incarceration. But he's also a crime survivor. His son was murdered in New Orleans, and that crime has not yet been solved. But he said something that stuck with me throughout the process, what I want to share with you all. He said, everyone deserves joy and justice in their life. As lawmakers, we often get bogged down in policy details. We get drawn into the weeds and we go round and round over whether a bill should say may or should it say shall. And it's helpful to have a North Star, a set of values guiding our decisions. For the last 4 decades, our country has been on a course to hand out the most severe penalties possible for a wide range of crimes. Yet we keep hearing from victims and people in prison that their voices are not heard. We keep seeing examples of the system churning people through, wrecking lives, and creating new victims. When attempting to fix this system, we have to resist the urge to simply aim for a more efficient version of what we have. We have to see the human beings impacted by it and aim to give them a process and an outcome that are fair, a system that hears their voices and values their lives, and that also lets them move on with their lives. So I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but it is not mission accomplished. We have not reached the finish line in Louisiana. There's a lot more work to do, and I'm excited that these 3 people that you're going to hear from in just a moment are going to remain engaged, and that the Pew Charitable Trust will remain engaged in Louisiana. So to lawmakers in other states and members of Congress, I hope you'll join us in this work. And if there's anything we've done in Louisiana that would be helpful, either here in Washington, D.C. or around the country, all they have to do is call on us, and we're happy to share all the information that we have, and hopefully we can help them in their efforts. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be here with today, and I'm going to call up Terry Schuster with the Pew Public Safety Performance Project. Thank you, and God bless.
To start, I just want to say thank you, Governor Edwards. This immense package of reforms passed in large part because of your vision and your work behind the scenes with sheriffs and other stakeholders, and your ability to lift up criminal justice as a priority, even in the face of historic flooding in central Louisiana and budget shortfalls and a lot of other things that were priorities as well. And your resilience in the face of hurdle after hurdle after hurdle along the way, which we'll hear a little bit about today. My name is Terry Schuster. Hi, everybody. I'm an officer at the Pew Charitable Trust and was part of the technical assistance team that worked in Louisiana with the governor and other state leaders around this criminal justice reform package. Joining me today are 3 brilliant panelists who I think you're going to find really fascinating and exciting. And they are Natalie Laborde, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Corrections. Natalie is an attorney. She has worked really closely with Governor Edwards and Governor Jindal before him on sentencing reforms. And she, as staff for the Louisiana Justice Reinvestment Task Force, was the central point of contact for hundreds of people engaged in justice reform and in this movement. Next to Ms. Laborde is Representative Tanner McGee. Tanner McGee is a member of the Louisiana House of Representatives. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee. He was one of 9 sponsors who carried the package of criminal justice reform bills in Louisiana, and is a total superstar in the legislature. Sitting next to him, Sheriff Craig Weber from Lafourche Parish is also a lawyer, so a panel of lawyers today. A lawyer and a sheriff and a national expert as a former president of the National Sheriff's Association, expert in evidence-based and innovative corrections and law enforcement, and offered an authoritative law enforcement voice as a champion for changes, improvements in the criminal justice system in Louisiana. So let's get started and let's hear from them. First question to Natalie Laborde to help set the scene for everyone. The governor mentioned 10 bills as part of this reform package. Can you tell us about the process that got us to 10 bills, what went into it, and how did those bills come about?
Sure, and I just thank you for having me today, and I'm here on behalf of my boss, Secretary LeBlanc, who couldn't be with us, but he brings to this task force 40 years of institutional knowledge and corrections and reentry, so it's really been a privilege for me to learn from him and be a part of this process. So as Governor Edwards mentioned, criminal justice reform efforts had begun in Louisiana for about 10 years. It had been very siloed, different groups working here and there, not a coordinated effort, but really began to take shape. And in the session of 2015, Representative Leger, who was also a sponsor of one of the criminal justice bills, passed a resolution that created this criminal justice reform task force to begin in 2015. The membership was what I like to call a heavy-hitting membership. It was the chairman of the criminal justice committees on both the House and the Senate side, members from the community, the faith-based community, law enforcement, sheriff, DAs. And what was also really, really key about this, I think everyone here, if you've been in government and politics, you served on some board where a lot of times the members send proxies or half the membership doesn't show up. Every person, including the Supreme Court Chief Justice, who was a member of this, came to each one of these meetings, which was out of town for a lot of people. So it commenced in 2015. We had about 12 entire task force meetings, and PEW was our staff for that. They came in and worked specifically with DOC, did the most extensive data-driven policy overview of our demographics, looked at what's driving our population, what our population makeup is, how long these people are serving, what parishes they are coming from, and provided for the beginning of the task force, the first couple meetings, that data, that information to give an overview of, of what we're looking at here in Louisiana. From there, we broke up into 3 subgroups. One was the corrections finance area. The next was community corrections, dealing with alternatives to incarceration and probation and parole. And then third was the sentencing reform. Secretary LeBlanc, he was the chair of the task force and also the chair of the financing group, but he and I attended all of these, so all of these groups were very well staffed. In addition to those, I would say each subgroup probably had about 5 to 6 individual meetings where they broke out and talked about the drivers, the potential policy changes we could make or recommendations that they could make to the task force based on what other states have done. And then in addition to that, and the advocate here as well, we held community roundtables with victims to hear about what is important to them in terms of criminal justice reform, what they would like to see, which was really monumental in Louisiana in my time, which is about 10 years in criminal justice policy. I haven't really heard of much coordinated effort like that going on amongst all the parties. And then lastly, once all of these subgroups had a chance to deliberate through all these different policies, they made final recommendations to the overall task force, who then deliberated on it quite a bit. We had public hearings. 2 of the task force meetings were dedicated strictly to those public hearings, where the community could come and give us the input on all sides of the spectrum about what's important. And, the overwhelming response from the community was a charge from the taxpayers to, we want public safety, we want rehabilitation, but we want to see what's being done in here in Louisiana. We want to see our system changed. And that was really a mandate for that task force, who at the end made a recommendation of policies about which eventually culminated in 10 bills, both to the governor and the legislature.
Thanks. So Representative McGee, pick it up from there. The task force makes their findings and recommendations, gives them to the legislature. What did you find most striking about their findings?
Well, the most striking thing was that not only were we an outlier in the United States and in the world, we were really an outlier in the South. And that's other conservative states, deeply red states. We take a lot of pride in Louisiana being 49 to Mississippi's 50th, and we weren't beating Mississippi in this category. for one. And so that, if you look at other states, South Carolina is a very similar state to Louisiana. It has a similar population base. It has a similar demographic and a similar crime rate. But yet they were incarcerating at a far less rate than Louisiana was. Our rate was showing a problem that we were out of whack with other conservative states. So it was not an issue of being hard on crime. We were just completely way out of line of where we needed to be. We're always competing with Texas, and Texas had underwent this process before us. And so there was a guiding light there to bring us in line. We take pride in Louisiana in being different, but I think we need to look at ways that we can assimilate ourselves and adopt best practices that other states have done.
So another one of the findings that stood out to several lawmakers was the sheer number of people coming into prison every year for failing on probation and parole supervision in the community. Sheriff Weber, can you talk to us about this population, about what does it take to be successful supervised in the community compared to in prison?
Sure, but let me just back up and kind of dovetail on that first issue you raised. I have seen in the 25 years that I've served as sheriff and my experience before that in law enforcement, that oftentimes bodies will create task force as a way to kick an issue down the road, not as a real meaningful opportunity for reform. And this was a phenomenal task force. The people that were represented on this task force were well thought of, were experts in their particular field, and put a lot of effort into this and produced a great report that Representative Tanner just talked about. But the difference between this report and the other reports that's getting put on a shelf and collect dust is the leadership of our governor and our Secretary of the Department of Corrections. Those two men, this is a first-term Democratic governor in a red state with $1 billion deficit. Mm-hmm. He certainly did not have to take on the mantra of justice reinvestment. And without his unwavering support and leadership, this issue would never have seen the light of day. So I just want to take a moment to point out how important it is and what a tremendous job our governor did and our Secretary of Corrections, Mr. Jimmy LeBlanc. To the question of people being supervised in the community, I think there are three things that are important that we have to take note of. First is reentry. We have to have meaningful reentry initiatives that take a person who has been incarcerated for as little as a year, as long as 30 years, and properly prepare them to reintegrate into society in a meaningful way. And that can be accomplished in several ways. One, we have to have valid, legitimate needs assessments. We have to identify the deficiencies, whether it's substance abuse, mental health, cognitive disabilities, whatever it is that we can do to prepare them for reentry. We should do that based on science, not based on one size fits all. We need to help them get employed through transitional work programs or work release centers so that they come out with some resources to assist themselves. So the reentry piece is big, and there's a lot that has been done in the area of reentry, and that's the starting point. Then we have to do, and what this legislation has done in large part, is eliminate tripwires. You know, eliminate the things that people fail because they have no meaningful opportunity to succeed at, like huge financial obligations that they can never, realistically repay. An identification card, the ability to apply for a job, transportation to and from work, housing when it's not available. You know, some inmates are fortunate enough to have family that will take them in and fill those gaps, but many do not. And so we have to do what this legislation tries to do, and what Representative McGee talked about is eliminate some of the tripwires. And most importantly, we have to invest in that infrastructure. And the governor pointed out we need more probation officers and parole officers because we're going to have more people in the community. We need to reduce the caseloads so that they're manageable, so that they can get meaningful interaction with their probation and parole officer. We need to determine who is the highest risk, because you have needs assessment and risk assessment. They're two different things. People with high risk need greater amount of supervision. And we should have some customization into what the sanctions are. Again, not one size fits all. If someone has educational deficiencies, reading comprehension issues, mental health, dual diagnosis, whatever the case may be, let's tailor that intervention strategy and make sure that we have the infrastructure to provide those services. We also can rely on technology as a way of reducing cost. Electronic monitoring, FaceTime, day reporting. There are many opportunities, and the reinvestment piece is critical. Taking those dollars that are being spent on incarceration and redirecting them to provide opportunities for people to succeed is the key point, the cornerstone of the success of JRI.
So let's talk about the political landscape a little bit. Representative McGee, can you give us an idea, given that some other priorities this past session were actually stalled out or derailed by partisanship, why didn't that happen with criminal justice?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it a couple of times here. We are unique right now in that we have a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature, so we have to accomplish things in a bipartisan manner if we're going to do anything at all. And I think what changed on this particular issue was the groundswell of stakeholders that we had, because on the right side of it, you had business groups, you had Christian faith leaders, libertarian groups who all bought in, and they all were advocates for this issue. The business guys saw that we were wasting a lot of money. You would never run a business like this. The Christian faith guys saw it as people deserve a second chance. They deserve a chance for redemption. That's what the Bible tells us. And then on the left side, you have ACLU and all these guys to see the constitutionality for them. So everybody had a stake in this. And what we did, and why I didn't get derailed, though, was I think we stayed away from the dialogue of partisan talk. We kept that out of the conversation. We didn't go into our Republican talking points. We didn't go into our Democrat talking points. We checked some egos at the door. This wasn't the administration's package we're going to run through the legislature. We didn't do it that way. We selected 7 Republican authors for the bills, 2 Democrat authors for the bill, and 1 independent. So you had a coalition of everybody. Even within those 7 Republicans, you had a wide spectrum of ideologies from the far right to the moderate to almost Democrat, middle. And so we had that perfect package. And anytime the conversation started getting partisan or divided, we brought it back to the data and to the evidence, and we talked about numbers. We talked about good policy. We talked about the things that we need to do as a state to move forward, to be a leading state in the South and no longer just trailing behind and being reactionary. So when we kept the conversation that way, we were able to accomplish in a bipartisan manner. And I remember there was a particular day that that the partisanship fighting was tough, and they wanted to take it out on these bills. And we had to remind some of our Republican colleagues that this isn't the governor's package. He's leading on it. He supports it. But this is a bipartisan effort, and you're killing my bill as a Republican. You're not taking it out on the governor. You're not accomplishing anything by doing that. And I think having that conversation, having the right authors selected, and at the same time having that stakeholders of the Republican groups and the Democrat groups that all agree. You get them on board and agree, and they all recognize that there was a problem.
So one of the hurdles along the way is that it's not totally intuitive for the public, for legislators, for other stakeholders, this idea that it could be good for public safety to reduce the amount of time somebody spends in prison. So this question, tossing it maybe to 2 of you on the panel, first to Ms. Laborde, then to Sheriff Weber, how do you explain that?
I think before answering that question, it's important for people to understand the historical context in Louisiana in terms of our incarcerated population. So roughly the 70s and 80s is when we really started to ratchet up the penalties, increase the time people are serving for nonviolent and violent offenses. We enacted pretty strongly something called truth in sentencing, which was also known as the 85% rule, and that was a time in which the federal government was giving states federal dollars for highways, for building more prisons in exchange for increasing the actual time that someone would serve for violent crime specifically. And this was also known as the war on crime, the war on drugs. And each year, Louisiana's population started to grow about 1,000 every year, and about we got to about 2012, we had roughly 42,000 people currently incarcerated. And you would think, logically, that if this were working, we would also see a drastic decrease in our crime rates. But sadly, that wasn't the case at all. So within that landscape, we started to see actually over the next 5 years a population reduction. This occurred when Terry mentioned my previous role in a different administration. We started to finally see a stabilization of that population and then a downward trend. And that really correlated with the first efforts of what we saw with sentencing and policy reform. We had the Sentencing Commission, which was reestablished, and they started to piecemeal reforms with changes in mandatory minimums and then also opening up more opportunities for parole eligibility and probation. And then also within the executive branch, Secretary LeBlanc, his philosophy that he implemented when he became secretary was a focus on reentry and rehabilitation. So Louisiana being so unique with how we house our population, roughly half of the population is housed at the local level, which is probably one of the biggest drivers of our incarceration rate as well. DOC began to invest in the local level and create the same types of programs that we have in the state facilities for our longer serving offenders. Within the next 5 years, we saw not only our populations trend downward, we saw our recidivism rates go down. And what that told us was, so what we implemented on a smaller scale of sentencing reform, of reducing the penalties and doing more swift and certain sanctions, of investing in specialty courts like drug courts or reentry court, where the goal is to take someone who has a longer sentence and give them the opportunity for training, rehabilitation, and mentorship, and if they succeed, actually reduce that sentence, and then put them back in the community with transitional services. And so the data has really shown us that the longer sentences are not necessarily proportionate to a reduction in crime. For example, someone we've learned just in the prison system, if you take someone who's a very low-level, low-risk offender, take them out of their job and put them in a cohort of higher-risk inmates, they actually, when they transition out, become better criminals because they've been sitting in prison all day with people who are teaching them to become a better criminal. So all of that data, like I just mentioned, has really shown us, and in all the other states that PEW has worked in, that smart approaches to criminal justice reform is making sure that the right resources, the right rehabilitative, the right training services are provided to help people receive the consequences of their behavior, but then transition back into the communities.
Sheriff?
As an elected sheriff in Louisiana, our Constitution provides that I am the chief law enforcement officer of that parish. It also gives me the responsibility of operating the parish jail. So you would think to yourself that the mission to protect and serve as the chief law enforcement officer of a parish might be inconsistent with the concept of shortening prison sentences. I disagree. I disagree for the following reasons. I've never had an ambulance or a police car drive up to my jail with someone having a heart attack or a broken leg and say, here, they're your problem. But like jails across the country every day, people who are bipolar and schizophrenic are being incarcerated. People who are homeless and poor are being incarcerated. People who have addictions are being incarcerated as a remedy for the problem without ever treating the underlying causes. I've been blessed to be part of a proof of concept of reengineering, reinvesting, and changing the criminal justice system to produce meaningful results, better results, and improve public safety. As I sit here, there are 100 convicted drug offenders in Lafourche Parish that are not in jail. They're in a drug treatment court. And that drug treatment court takes the power and authority of the criminal justice system to enforce compliance. It takes the treatment component and the drug testing component and the accountability piece and the recognition, moral recognition, and produces a much better result. Those people in Lafourche Parish that go through a drug treatment court are not reoffending. They are part of productive, healthy citizens. Other therapeutic courts, such as mental health courts, such as veterans courts, are likewise producing better results. If those same 100 people were in my jail anywhere from 1 month to 10 years and were released, as 95% of the people will be, as the governor pointed out, are released untreated, it would not be long before they would recidivate, before they would be involved in criminal misconduct. So the idea that we can use evidence and we can use alternatives and we can produce better results and make our communities safer is a real idea, and they are proven results. I would much rather let someone out who has been treated in 3 years than keep them there for 6 years, because they're going to be a greater threat. And I also sit in a unique position. As I mentioned, I operate the jail, and we're also the chief law enforcement officer. So if you think of the responsibility of apprehending people who commit crimes through investigations or through interactions with law enforcement, once we have someone who is a known criminal offender, we tend to just wash our hands and say, move on to corrections, and now let me take on the next case and the next offender. We're losing the opportunity to reduce victimization and to reduce danger by identifying that lawbreaker early on in the process and intervening in a way that changes that behavior, whether it's a drug court, whether it's an assessment tool, whether it's community supervision, monitoring, whatever it is that creates a productive citizen, also reduces the potential victims and makes our community safer.
So another piece of this reform package was some changes to how criminal justice fines and fees work. In this 10-bill package, the one bill that you sponsored, Representative McGee, was about fines and fees. Can you tell everybody a little bit more about what it did and why?
Sure. In Louisiana, this kind of actually is something we still need to address, is that the court system is funded by the criminal himself. He pays fines and fees that ultimately funds the court system on the criminal side. And basically, you'd plead guilty if you're accused of a crime, not going to go to trial. You get offered a plea bargain, you plead guilty, you get assessed these fines and fees, and then if there's a victim that's owed some money, there will be a restitution amount that's added to it. So you agree to this so that you can be on probation. One of the problems that you have in this system is there's no accounting for the person's ability to pay. So you may have an issue where this guy he's working at McDonald's because he doesn't have a whole lot of employment opportunities, and he's struggling to get by his child support payments. He has other obligations, but he has this amount that he owes the court system that he has to pay, or he's going to go back to jail. And quite often what happens is the judges will call you in and say you have to have $2,000 by tomorrow for the restitution amount or for your fine, or you're going back to jail. And a lot of times it's a scare tactic. He comes up with some money. Sometimes, but all judges are different. Sometimes they really require it of him. It always concerns me, like, you give a guy 7 days to go find $2,000. Where did he go get that $2,000 from? And so did he go commit another crime to pay for his restitution amount? And so we really wanted to tie it to their ability to pay. So now what we're doing is we're requiring the judges to do some deep diving into this guy's economic status, his ability to pay. What is he doing? Is he getting all the jobs he can get? And what is his money? And then we are stipulating a payment amount that he has to make. And then out of that payment amount, half of it, each payment goes to the victim to make sure the victim's made as close to being whole as she can, or he can. And so through that process, and if you are a good person in this plan, if you continually make your obligations, eventually we will allow you off the plan and back in when your probation and parole ends. It's also important because it's going to drive down the probation and parole numbers, because what these judges were doing is extending out probation and parole for a really long time to make sure that this guy got all his money. So you may have committed a crime 10 years ago, but he's still in the court system, still having the chance, and he hasn't recommitted any other crimes. The only thing he hasn't done is made all of his payments. So we're really imprisoning people for financial reasons. It's just not a good way to do it. And we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to meet their obligations, but do it in a way that has them the ability to also make their other obligations and get on their right foot so they have a chance of not reoffending.
Let me add to that. About 3 years ago, my staff and I were noticing that we were arresting a lot of people for failure to pay fine and cost. They would plead guilty to a misdemeanor offense, most of them. The judge would assess a $100, $200, $500 fine, 10 days in jail. They would have a period of time to pay, and they would not pay. And then a warrant would come out for failure to pay. And so we said, what is the issue here? And we sat down and did something that Representative Tanner McGee did. We set up payment plans. And so we started bringing people in and said, look, how much can you afford? $10 a week? $50 a month? Okay, here's your payment plan. And we're going to check on you, and we're going to see what your success is. And what we've discovered in the last 2 years is that we have an 89% success rate in collection on the payment plan. And in 1 full year of just recognizing that some people can never accumulate $500 because other necessities like food and electric bills come in and they have to give that money up, but they can sometimes manage $50. In 1 year, we issued 2,000 less failure to pay attachments simply by doing a payment plan. So what Representative McGee is talking about, it's real and it's important and it's significant.
And also, one of the other things, too, that my bill did was the judge had some other tools. Also, you could take away your driver's license, which, I mean, in a state like Louisiana, to be employed, you basically have to drive. So when you take away somebody's driver's license, what you're really doing is taking away his ability to work. And so you're taking away the means that he would accomplish getting the money to him and leaving him either having to break the law and drive illegally or not being able to meet his obligations. So it was stuff like that would say, well, it's better for you to keep your driver's license and go to job, and that's part of the bill as well, and building off of what he said. And I think, I kind of joked about my bill during the time. It's kind of like the QVC plan, because I think if you look, when they try to sell you a vacuum cleaner, it's $1,000. Well, nobody thinks they can do that, so they don't buy it. But what QVC smartly does is like, well, 10 easy payments of $29.99, you get your vacuum cleaner. Well, you think you can do that, so you do it. And it's the same thing we're trying to do with the person who's reoffending, is giving them something that they believe they can do too, instead of saying you owe 40 grand. And they're gonna be like, there's no way on God's green earth I can repay 40 grand, but I can make $29.99 payments every month. So having that, I think that psychology is also big, big to the chance of success.
And there was this innovative piece of that bill, too, that was about debt forgiveness. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we were struggling with is we want people to meet their obligations, and we want them to not streak away from it. That's, part of the process. And so we were kind of going back and forth on how you do that. So basically, at the end of this, it becomes a civil judgment. So it's no longer, whatever is uncollected, you still owe, but you owe civilly. You can't go back to jail for it. And so then it goes turned over to our Attorney General's office, and then he can go through other means of collections. So if you'd ever get a job that pays more money, if you'd ever come into an inheritance, or if you had any kind of other access, he's there with a civil judgment to collect on it and pay back the victims anything, or the court system. So we want to create a means that he still had the obligation, but it was not necessarily he's going to end up back in the criminal justice system. We're moving him from criminal to civil, where it should be.
So there were a lot of recommendations from the task force that had to do with financial matters or that had to do with lower level crimes, but some of the recommendations also had to do with some of Louisiana's longest serving prisoners. So Ms. Laborde, could you tell us a little bit more about those recommendations and how they were received by the legislature and the public?
Sure. I think the task force did a great job of balancing, keeping that emphasis on reforms to nonviolent, lower level, low risk offenders, but also taking an objective look at our population and what the drivers are. And roughly 5,000 of our inmates are geriatric. In Louisiana, that's considered anyone over 55. And 4,000 of those are serving life without parole. And what's unique about Louisiana is we're one of, if not the only state that still allows for life without parole on a flat sentence, on a second-degree, first-degree murder. In other states, these same types of offenders would be eligible for parole in Texas, South Carolina, and other southern states. So what the task force did, they also looked at this aging population and the cost associated with that, specifically with medical care. Representative McGee talks about this guy who costs routinely the Department of Corrections $1 million. And that was just for his medical treatment, the level of care that was required. And because he's not eligible to draw down Medicaid dollars, the taxpayers pay 100% of that cost. So in light of all these realities, they came up with a couple different policy changes and recommendations, one of which was looking at that population that was not parole eligible at all. And they recommended what we call geriatric parole, and that would be someone would have to have served 30 years and be at least 50 years of age. Initially, that wasn't very well received by law enforcement, especially the DAs. Their main concern was the promises that were made to victims at the times of the pleas or the convictions, and the realities of going back on their word for that. So there was a lot of pushback on that, and we eventually came to a great compromise where there was a certain population in the 70s who at the time they were convicted for second-degree murder, the penalty was actually parole with the life with the opportunity for parole after 40 years. And so the DAs, consistent with their own argument in terms of the victims and the promises were made, applied that to these guys as well. Those who, at the time, there was an expectation of parole eligibility, both for the perpetrator and for the victim. So we were all able to agree to restore parole eligibility for this group of individuals at 40 years. And we just started to hear those before the parole board. And that has really, really boosted morale at Angola specifically, where 95% of those people aren't exiting, and you have to create a very unique environment where there's an incentive to live peacefully. If someone thinks they're never leaving or they don't have any opportunity for hope, what's the incentive there to better themselves? Secondly, when they looked at that huge medical cost, we expanded upon something that we already have. Most states have some form of medical parole in which the parole board can determine that someone has a low risk based on their medical needs and parole them either to their home or to a medical facility. But for us, it was very restrictive because it excludes first and second degree murderers. Well, the reality is the majority of our sick aging population are first and second degree murder lifers at Angola. And so the task force looked at this mostly from a medical perspective of, if we are treating these people at Angola, which has become sort of a hospice and hospital program, we could more efficiently and effectively treat them in a nursing home facility and draw down the Medicaid dollars, which can pay up to 90%, and reduce the burden on Louisiana taxpayers. And so that was well received on both ends of the spectrum because there's a lot of checks and balances in place. The secretary has to make a recommendation, the medical staff has to make a recommendation, the warden has to make a recommendation, and then ultimately it has to be approved by the board and they have to be paroled to a facility. And that just, even though it won't be a large number of individuals, just in terms of the reduction in the medical cost side and using those dollars that we can better invest into staff and programs elsewhere. And then lastly, one of the other important things was the juvenile lifers, which has been a very hot topic across the country. Louisiana was impacted by the recent Supreme Court, both federal and state, ruling that you cannot automatically sentence a juvenile to life without parole. There has to be a meaningful determination on an individual basis. And that implicated about 300 juvenile lifers for us in the Department of Corrections. And it was, that played out very difficultly over the last 2 years. And this governor really took a lot of leadership in bringing everyone together and saying, we have to make a decision. We can't continue to put this off. And so the decision was made that for the currently incarcerated population, the DAs had about 3 months to decide, am I going to pursue a hearing for life without parole on this individual, or am I going to waive it and they can go forward and move forward with the board after 25 years? The majority, I don't have the exact numbers, but for the majority of them, the DAs did decide to move forward. Just last week, Secretary's orderly, who's been incarcerated since he was 17 years old, he's now 53. His name's Charlie. He wouldn't mind me giving his name. Went before the board and was paroled. He had the support from the DAs, the sheriffs, the victims' families. And everyone was so inspired by just what he had done since day one when he came in there, to take responsibility for his actions and to enroll in programs that he didn't even get any good time or any credit for. He just did it to make himself a better person. So that's just one example of how these changes that everyone came together impacted a life that's going to go out there and maybe, who knows, help prevent other people from hurting people and coming back into our prison system. So those were the three major areas that the task force really took some bold steps in addressing our longer serving inmates. And the more controversial area of looking at what we can do to reform how we handle violent crimes.
And say a little bit more about a lot of sentences for any crimes were already long, and then the habitual offender penalties were multipliers of those sentences. What were the changes on that front?
Yeah. So in most states have this form or tool, as many people call it, the habitual offender law, the 3 strikes you're out, and that's used as an enhancement for the penalties. Even if someone isn't necessarily billed as a habitual offender, it's something that's hung over their head in the plea negotiations about it. If you don't plead to this, this second offense crime. If we go to trial and you're found guilty, I'm going to triple bill you, and your time is going to be 3 times as long. And it's really gotten out of control in Louisiana. That's why you could hear of stories like someone is serving life for simple possession of marijuana, and that's because they had a prior criminal history, and on that offense they were multi-billed. So the DAs, they really stepped up because that is a tool that they often use, and they agree that some changes needed to be made. So what we agreed to was a reduction in what we call the cleansing period. So it used to be, the prior law was that any offense that occurred within the last 10 years could be used as an enhancement, and that was reduced to 5 years. And then also reducing the penalty ranges. So for most offenses, the habitual offender bill could be used to increase the minimum amount of time by 2 and to increase the maximum amount of time by, I believe, 3. And they agreed to reduce that, to reduce both the minimum time that it could enhance you and both the maximum time as well. And I don't think you can't necessarily track fully track the implementation of that because, like I said, it's sometimes often used as a bargaining tool. But realistically speaking, this is going to have a ripple effect in really curbing very lengthy and disproportionate sentences.
So let's talk about crime victims. Sheriff, from where you sit, what sorts of things do you hear from victims and victim advocates about what's important to them? How did victim advocates show up in this policy process? And in what ways does the reform package address those priorities?
Sure. Having been in the criminal justice system over 30 years, I had the benefit of seeing victims' rights laws enacted. For most of recorded history, victims were not given any formal recognition in the criminal justice system. It was prosecuted by the state, and society was the victim, and the person who actually suffered from the crime was maybe a witness at best. Now we have created, rightfully, opportunities for victims, and we've created a powerful voice. And the thing that made this successful, in my opinion, and helped get it passed was that, and the governor mentioned by name, Mr. Daniels was a crime victim. No one else in that task force can understand. We can have empathy and sympathy, and we can pray with him, but we can't understand what it's like to have someone murdered very close to us, unless that's happened. So his perspective was very critical to the task force and to the work and to the recommendations. The task force wisely had roundtables that were specific with victims, and they had one in New Orleans, which is the largest metropolitan city, urban area in Louisiana. But they had a similar one in a rural part, in the central part of Louisiana, so they could get perspectives from different points of view and different crime victims. And crime victims unanimously pretty much want the same things. First, safety and security. Something has happened to them. They've lost that feeling of safety, and they want to be reassured that they can be protected. Secondly, they want to be restored or made whole or compensated in some fashion. If they lost something, they want to be treated for injuries or psychological counseling or something that was taken from them. That's important. Probably the most important thing is they want to be part of the process. They want information, notification, transparency. They want to be able to be informed and consulted. Some, but not all, want to have an opportunity to make a statement at the sentencing or after the sentencing or at some point in the process. They want to share deeply personal perspectives with them and help them get through that process. But you know what they all want? They almost all want no one else to be a victim, no one else to have to suffer what they suffered. So what they contributed to the task force and to the legislation was invaluable. Part of what the legislature did was recognize that in the financial contribution, 50% of the money that is collected is earmarked for restitution, giving victims that recognition that they'll have that opportunity for restitution. In addition to that, the reinvestment funds are going to support victim services, victims programs. Something that specific to law enforcement and victims pointed out was that police officers are really good at interrogating suspects and looking for evidence and processing crime scenes. They sometimes are not really good in the touchy-feely part. And so they'd like to see officers get more training and members of the criminal justice system get more training into how to interact with victims and survivors. And there are many victims who themselves become perpetrators because they were victims. And so they have those dual roles. And they expect that, even though they're a victim, once you pay your debt, we're a forgiving society. We believe that you pay your debt and you have a second chance. They can evaluate the legislation. They can evaluate the research. They can look at what other states have done. They can look at the information provided by the Pew Center, and they can come to a legitimate, rational, informed decision. Yes, I'm a victim, but I also recognize that putting someone in jail for a long time and throwing away the key, as we sometimes say, is not going to make me safer, because that person's going to exit the system and they're going to re-victimize someone else. So I think the inclusion of victims, the recognition of their rights and their input was invaluable to the success. They were not mutually exclusive. They were complementary in many areas.
So last question from me before I open up to the floor for questions from folks in the audience. This one for Representative McGee. A lot of the folks in the room are congressional staffers. As they consider sentencing and corrections reform at the federal level, any guidance from you, who's shepherded reforms through the state process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing is the building blocks are there. I mean, they're there in Louisiana in the challenges we face. They're there here, too, because all the stakeholders have the same opinion. You have the groups on the right and the left that have recognized and see the problem. So you have the ingredients you need to make it happen. But what you need to do is you need to rely on them, first of all, for their support and talk to their constituency bases. And the main thing, too, to that point is you have to build a coalition. I talked about earlier, my thing is about talking in the right dialogue, talking in the right, this is evidence-based. This is going to produce the best results for the people. And you got to get out of the dialogue of Republican versus Democrat. And that's, I know, a difficult challenge, but it definitely can be done because we did it. And I think that's the major thing. I mean, you also have to set up the system right, too. I mean, I know that, I don't know the dynamics in D.C. That's not my wheelhouse. But in Louisiana, I have at least appreciation of it a little bit, where, the House is one animal and the Senate's another animal. And you got to know when you set this thing up, what bills you want to start in the Senate, what bills you want to start in the House. You want to know what authors you need in the Senate, what authors you need in the House. And you need to make sure that those authors have the respect and they can talk to the people across the aisle, because you're not going to get it done by yourself. One party can't pass this. I mean, I don't think that's possible. But I do think it's possible that if you engage your stakeholders, bring them to the table, and you set up properly, it can be done like we did it.
So let's open it up for questions. We've got maybe 5 minutes before we should wrap up and thank everybody. Question from... We've got some mic runners. We're going to run a mic to you.
You mentioned incarceration. Well, how many people do we have incarcerated in Louisiana today? And I know the sheriff mentioned half of the people in the states, different parishes. So what's the number? And second quick question, how much do we get in federal funds to the governor's office for crime? And has that number gone up or down in the last couple of years?
First, in terms of our population, we're at about roughly 35,200. And as I mentioned, we've seen a downward trend since 2012. We're down at our peak was roughly 41,000. So, and with the help of Pew, why these reforms were so critical is that based on their projections, they saw that while we have seen a great downward trend, if we didn't do anything, if all things remain the same, we would stabilize or even begin to creep back up. In terms of the federal dollars, I apologize, I'm not the best person to answer. I know we do receive Title I funding in terms of our education programs, and then the Medicaid dollars can be utilized at some point for post 23-hour care for inmates that are required to go to the emergency rooms. But that doesn't follow them just for their ordinary care within the system. It's otherwise suspended. And I don't know if I'm missing any other federal funding.
There's some new federal funding around the national opioid crisis that is used in a lot of places, specifically for alternatives to incarceration. And so that's kind of a new line of funding. And there's also funding from SAMHSA that goes toward behavioral health programs, which are often sort of an overlapping population with the incarcerated population. I saw your hand.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's a very obvious. I don't know.
Mic
if this is-
working?
I don't. Okay, so. Yeah, you mentioned that it's such a bipartisan effort that it seems like a lot to reform-minded people. This is a no-brainer, but then it's so hard to get things done. So I was wondering if you could point to any institutions that have been particularly a barrier to getting these done and how you overcome some of those barriers. And secondly, you talk about reinvesting savings. And I was just wondering if you could point to any specific reentry services that have been particularly effective that could be rolled out in other states.
I mean, look, I can answer the first part. I don't know about the second part. It's not easy. I mean, it sounds easy now. We're all up here talking about it. It's probably the most stressful couple months of my life when we were doing this. I mean, the amount of negotiations with everybody was unbelievable. And the DA's, the District Attorney's Association, and the law enforcement arena was probably our two biggest obstacles. I don't want to call them obstacles. They became willing partners towards the end, and they really did come to the table and work. But it wasn't, it was a struggle to get to that point. And we really had to negotiate and now have a lot of buy-in and really lean on the different constituency bases. So, for example, I'll give you an example. If you had a member of a committee who was kind of squishy about it, and you knew that he was also big with the conservative right on Christian issues, well, we got people from the conservative right to call him, from Christian people, and say, hey, I'm Pastor so-and-so, I believe in this. And so you had to get that low level, down in the details, make him feel comfortable about making that vote. If he was a business guy, I tell people all the time, I told Natalie earlier today, whenever I go to a civics group and I can see they're kind of iffy on this stuff, I bring up the $1 million prisoner and immediately they're on my side. Because they're like, oh, we're paying $1 million a year for one guy? I'm like, yeah, we're doing that. Like, well, that's, we need to do something about that. I was like, I agree. Thank God, now we're talking the same language. So if you had a business guy, you go get the business guys who were invested in this, and you get them to talk to them. I mean, we literally went member by member in the House, identifying our guys that had problems, and then finding a constituency base that could give him the comfort level or ease his concerns that he may have that were legitimate, and work through that process, and then negotiate too with some of the with the guys who were really opposed to it from the outset, and say, well, you can't do this, can you do this? And that's kind of how the process went. I think that at least answers the first part of the question.
To the point of the question about what sorts of programs and services actually work and have there's a lot of ways to answer that. One kind of quick way would be if you check out the Washington State Institute of Public Policy. They have put together a resource of cost-benefit analyses of different types of programs and interventions, showing for different types of services what's the cost-benefit of each, and how much does it reduce recidivism and that sort of thing.
And I failed to mention it earlier, and I think it's an important point, is at some point, though, you can bring in all the negotiations you want and the discussions. At some point, you just got to push it through a little bit, and you can't water it down too much, because I think we were starting to get close to that a couple points in our session, because we have a bad habit in Louisiana of wanting to change, talking about change, filing the bill. Everybody sees the bill, freaks out, and then we water it down to where it does absolutely nothing. We pass it, and then we all congratulate, good job, and we all kind of know at the back of our mind we didn't do anything. And it was important that we didn't do that here. So at some point, you could negotiate here and here and here, but you had to let the people who are opposing you know that this is not up for negotiation.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Okay, good. I wanted to ask, I think my question would be mostly to Ms. Laborde. As far as I know, there's one particular aspect of the changes that you've been incorporating in your state, which is collaboration between your department and the Department of Behavioral Health. Because I attended the annual conference of the Oxford House in August over here, and they were briefing about it, and the fact that you put some portion of your state budget into that pilot project to put a criminal liaison so that you could address some of those tripwires that the sheriff was mentioning. If a person is now back in society and he still has an addiction problem or whatever. So I just wanted you to tell how that's going, if that's been launched, if there's any already successes from that.
Unfortunately, I'm probably not the best person. DHH could speak on that better. But what I can in relationship to the reinvestment question as well that overlaps with what you asked about, With the reinvestment requirement of this bill, 70% of the savings is required to be reallocated back into the Department of Corrections programs and then community grants. And so similarly to what we've done with the Oxford House, that is the plan, to engage with DHH and take those funds that are going to be granted out to community services and partner with those types of programs, because one of Secretary's biggest things that he would like to see before he eventually retires from corrections is the creation of halfway houses. We have something that the closest that we have to that in Louisiana is work release, which generates a variety of opinions. But the reality is it's a transitional program for someone to work, engage in the community, but yet they're still being monitored. But those people come back to prison at night. So there should be another step similar to the Oxford House, where it's a transitional living situation where they get substance abuse, they get mental health programs, but they're also working and reintegrating back into society. So that's a huge portion of the reinvestment plan. I'm really confident that's going to move forward. This governor has protected our budget for the first time in, I think, 8 years. We didn't have a cut, which was just monumental for us. And so if all things go well through the legislature, that's really going to be our fight, that those dollars will be protected and that we will be able to reinvest them not only back into the department and the programs that we're doing with reentry and substance abuse and vocational training, but into those community programs in conjunction with DHH and behavioral health.
We've got just a few more minutes, so I want to take one more question, if I can, right in the front.
Great. So I just wanted to touch on something that didn't really come up, which is the issue of race. Obviously, the criminal justice system is disproportionately affecting poor Black and brown communities, and these reforms are, of course, intended to reduce some of those disparities as well. My question is about implementation. When you have people in the system, both in the courts and in the parishes, who have been operating in one context for a long time, and then also maybe bringing some of those implicit biases to the job, what kind of training or what kind of efforts are you doing to make sure that the alternatives and the new approaches are going to be accessible across the population and that you're not going to see the same disparities that you saw initially?
I can speak from the DOC side and Sheriff can speak from the law enforcement side, but I think overall in terms of, our major engagement with the community is through probation and parole. And so two of the focuses that have come from Secretary's leadership is, one, changing the culture and the mindset of probation and parole. Historically, it's been what he calls a cowboy mentality. So success was defined by revoking people, locking them back up. And over the last 10 years, we've implemented a lot of policy changes in terms of our training of our probation and parole officers. Secondly, I think another component, too, is focusing in on those parishes. Louisiana, 5 of the parishes generate 40% of our population. So directing resources towards there in terms of education and awareness and best practices and changing the mindsets in terms of how probation officers, local and state, are working. And then lastly, with the reinvestment, and we're currently in what we call phase 2, where we've partnered much similar to the help that Pew's given us. We have the Criminal Justice Institute who's helping us with the phase 2 implementation. But we've been mapping out how we're going to do the reinvestment on the DOC side, on the probation parole side. And what PNP really tells us is, look, we're ready for this new cultural change. We've been implementing it as best as we can. We have overwhelming caseloads. We have limited resources. So one of the things they ask for in terms of reinvestment is a community resource coordinator who's almost more of a social work background in the districts, whose their sole function is to be working with all the community programs in terms of rehab and substance abuse and vocational training to help better facilitate that for the inmates, and then also to do training with the officers, the probation and parole, and continuing to develop that mindset of we are here to help come alongside them, and success is keeping someone out in the community, back in their families, back in their jobs.
Let me make a distinction. A prison, which is the Department of Corrections operates, is an institution where people serve a sentence after they've been adjudicated and convicted. Most jails are areas that have people who are pre-adjudication. They get arrested and they get booked and they get put in jail waiting adjudication. So there's a big distinction in a prison and a jail. From a jail perspective, the racial composition is largely driven by arrest rates. And so implicit bias as it exists in the minds of law enforcement officers would be where the training would have to be focused. But more general to your question, I don't believe that the JRI was necessarily specific to looking at racial imbalances. However, it does provide funding to do that. And really the gatekeepers are more in the district attorneys or the prosecutors and the judges who sentence. And implicit bias that would exist in those areas probably control more the prison population than other factors. But it's certainly a good opportunity for future legislation and a good use of dollars that come from the reinvestment piece, in my opinion.
And I think my bill that we talked about earlier, because it's requiring the judges to take an objective approach to the guy's finances or the girl's finances. And no longer is it the judge relying on his eye or how he feels about the case. He's actually having to take he's got to do a hearing to find out, will it be a substantial hardship? What does that mean? And he's got to look at the guy's financials records. He's got to look at his ability to pay. So now we're looking at him through objective metrics and not just as the subjective eye. And that's one of the things I think is really important with my legislation and what we were able to accomplish is that we're now looking more objectively and not quite as subjectively.
I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Governor Edwards. I want to thank the audience. Thank you so much for being here today.